small little fragments found in trash heaps in Egypt, where the rest of the book was destroyed, and we just have a little scrap. So we have from little scraps to enormous tomes that are in medieval libraries. We have 5,700 copies in Greek, and we have copies in other languages, because as Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, people translated the New Testament into other languages, such as Latin. We have something like 10,000 copies of the Bible in the New Testament in Latin, in Coptic, the ancient Egyptian language, in Syriac, in Georgian, in Armenian, in Old Church Slavonic, etc., etc. We have all sorts of copies in all sorts of languages. These copies can be compared with one another, and when you compare these copies with one another, there are lots of mistakes in them, because no two of these copies are exactly alike in their wording. How old are these copies that we have? Well, the oldest copy that we have of any book of the New Testament is actually a little fragment that was discovered in Egypt. This fragment is about the size of a credit card, and it's written on both front and back. That's significant, by the way, that it's written on both front and back, because it tells you that this copy actually came from a book. Like we have books today where you've got pages written on front and back, as opposed to a scroll. Christians early on preferred writing their scriptures in books rather than in scrolls. That made these books different from other books throughout the Roman world. This little credit card-sized scrap that we have is called P52. It's called P52 because it's written on papyrus. So papyrus is an ancient writing material, and it's called P52 because it was the 52nd papyrus that was discovered and categorized, classified, cataloged. So this little scrap has a few lines on it from John chapter 18. It's the passage where Jesus is talking to Pontius Pilate in his trial before Pilate, where Pilate says, "What is truth?" That line. So that's that. It's written on, and it's written both front and back. Now the thing is, if you have a little scrap like that, and it's written on the front and the back, and you know what passage it comes from, then you can actually do some interesting things, because you can figure out, even though you don't have a complete line on this page, you can figure out where this thing was on the page. And if you've got if you do it right, if you've got one margin, you can figure out how many letters were in each line, and you can figure out how many lines must have been on the page in order to get from this part to that part. See what I'm saying? So you can actually reconstruct how long the page was, and then you can calculate how many pages were in this manuscript, because how many pages would it take with this many letters in it to create the Gospel of John? And so this one scrap can tell you how long the manuscript was. So there are people who do this for a living, as it turns out. So this is the oldest scrap. How old is it? This scrap, P52, is usually dated to the first half of the 2nd century. The way they date ancient manuscripts is actually on the basis of a handwriting analysis. The science of this is called paleography. Paleo meaning ancient, graphy meaning writing, ancient writing. So the study of ancient writing is called paleography, and there are scholars who are paleographers who can date manuscripts within about 50 years of their production. The way the science works is that handwriting in the ancient world, before there was the invention of printing, changed slowly over time. So people made letters in certain distinctive ways depending on when they lived. And so if you are familiar with how handwriting was in different periods of history, then you can determine when a manuscript was written. That's the science of paleography. And a good paleographer can get within about 50 years. So this thing, and you need a 50-year gap, because some scribe who's copying a manuscript when he's 70 probably is writing the same way he did when he learned how to write when he was 20. And so you need a 50-year gap. So this thing is dated to around 125 plus or minus 25 years. Well, that's pretty early. This is from the Gospel of John. This little piece was probably written about 30 or 40 years after John itself had been produced. So that's pretty good. We don't get a complete copy of the Gospel of John until, again, around the year 200. But we do have this little scrap. Most of the manuscripts we have are not anywhere near this early, though. We start getting full manuscripts at the beginning of the 3rd century, around the year 200, 150, 170 years after Jesus' death. These are about 120 years after most of these books had been written. And we don't start getting numerous manuscripts until the 7th, 8th, or 9th centuries. And then we start getting lots of them, because then you've got monasteries where monks are spending their days copying manuscripts, and we have a lot of their manuscripts. And so 5,700 manuscripts, some of them going back into the 2nd century, none of them being the originals, or within even within a few years of the originals. So with all of these differences, with all of these manuscripts, how many differences are there? Throughout the Middle Ages, it appears that scholars didn't realize that there was a problem of not having the original text, or very few scholars realized that this was a problem. Even the scribes copying the text, they sometimes would realize there were differences in the manuscripts they were copying, but they didn't make a very big deal about it. The first time somebody made a really big deal about this was exactly 300 years ago this year, in the year 1707. There was a scholar named John Mill at Oxford. I think he's unrelated to the Victorian John Stuart Mill. This John Mill was a scholar of the Bible, and he had spent 30 years looking at manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, this is obviously after the invention of printing, and printers have to decide what text they're going to print, and the problem is they've got manuscripts that have differences among them. And so how does a printer decide which manuscript to print? Well, it's a problem. That's when they started realizing that this was an issue. Well, John Mill wanted to produce a printed edition of the Greek New Testament. He spent 30 years looking at the manuscripts available to him. He had available to him 100 manuscripts, approximately 100 manuscripts. And he printed up his edition of the Greek New Testament, in which he'd give a verse, and then at the bottom of the page he would indicate the places where the manuscripts differed from one another for that verse. To the shock and dismay of many of his readers, when John Mill produced his edition of the Greek New Testament, it included an apparatus at the bottom of the page that cited 30,000 places where the manuscripts differed from one another. 30,000 places where there were manuscript variations among the manuscripts that he had discovered. And the striking thing is, John Mill didn't give all of the differences he found. He only cited the differences that he thought were significant. Some of his detractors claimed that John Mill was working to render the text of Scripture uncertain. His supporters pointed out that he didn't create these differences. He simply noticed that they exist. So what do we know today about the numbers of mistakes in our manuscripts? Well, Mill looked at 100 manuscripts, and now we have 5,700 manuscripts. Nobody knows how many differences there are among the manuscripts that we now have, because nobody yet, even with the development of computer technologies, nobody has been able to add up all of the differences. Sometimes scholars guess there may be a couple 100,000 differences. Some people say 300,000, some say 400,000. There are different guesses. The way I usually put it to my students is in comparative terms. There are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. More differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Well, this obviously creates a problem. If you want to know what Mark actually said, and all you've got are copies of Mark that are hundreds of years later that have so many differences in them, how can you possibly reconstruct it? Well, that is a problem. Now, having said that we have these hundreds of thousands of differences, I want to emphasize a particular point, which is most of these differences that we have in our manuscripts are completely insignificant, unimportant, and don't matter for a thing. Many of these differences in the manuscripts are so unimportant that you can't replicate them in translation. Okay? In other words, like they changed the word order in Greek, where you'd have to translate it the same way no matter what the Greek word order is. So, I mean, it doesn't really matter very much. By far, the vast majority of these hundreds of thousands of differences are significant for nothing more than showing that scribes in antiquity could spell no better than my students can today. And scribes, of course, didn't have spell check. Scribes, in fact, didn't even have dictionaries. And many scribes didn't care how they spelled anything. Sometimes you'll be reading a manuscript and there'll be the same word that occurs, say, 3 times within a couple of lines, and the scribe will spell the same word 3 different ways. He just doesn't care how the word is spelled. Well, so, you've got lots and lots of those kinds of changes, and what do they matter for? They don't matter at all. So having said there are all these hundreds of thousands